I've been thinking for a long time that the outcome of the US presidential election, whether it was going to be President Harris or President Trump, was going to have perhaps more consequential results with regard to the US-China relationship than maybe any of the other major issues that this administration will have to deal with. So on economics, President Trump has, of course, said many, many times that he wants to impose a 60% tariff on goods coming from China. Clearly, if you're in Beijing, you're in the government there, you're in the Communist Party, then you'll be looking at the quite shaky economy of China in some ways and saying, well, maybe this is not going to be good for us. If we're talking about traditional security, then of course the key issue between the US and China has been and remains Taiwan. And the question of whether or not the appointment of a more hawkish cabinet might lead to more confrontation, or maybe a transactional cabinet that actually says, well, look, let's do a deal. And finally, one of the things that the Biden administration has pushed forward, at least at the start of its term, and perhaps faded a little bit in, is the question of whether democracies need to work together. For good or ill, that hasn't been particularly the tenor of the foreign policy offer that we've heard from the Trump campaign. And so we'll have to see if in the case of China, that values-driven language reemerges or whether it falls by the wayside. The relationship between President Donald Trump in his first term and General Secretary Xi Jinping of China is in some ways quite an ambivalent one. It's quite a complex one. Because the first Trump presidency was very hardline on China, on issues of trade, on issues of technology, and finally, of course, people beginning to forget, but we shouldn't forget, on issues of COVID. People tend to associate that phase with the whole of the policy. But it's worth remembering that there was a classic Mar-a-Lago moment early on where, in the words of the president, I'm not quoting here exactly, but this is the general gist of what was said. He said, I brought Xi Jinping to Mar-a-Lago, we were talking there, and I gave him the biggest, most beautiful piece of chocolate cake he had ever seen. I think the chocolate cake was part of the mixture, and then announced we were beginning to bomb Syria. Now, this was clearly a power gesture, but it's one that in some senses I think Xi Jinping would have understood. Xi Jinping comes from a tradition where top leaders coming together and having a sense of both intimacy and competition is very much part of the mixture. Both sides know they're competing with each other, both sides want to win, but they also know that they're kind of playing mind games with each other as well. And I very strongly suspect that the kind of gaming out of what a Donald Trump presidency meant at the time and what it would mean in the future is quite the parlor game in Beijing. In other words, the relationship is probably not the same, as much as we know, as with Vladimir Putin, with whom it seems that Donald Trump is able to have direct communication. I don't have a sense that that's quite the case with Xi Jinping. But the sense that this is someone who will respond to strength, shock and awe, but also maybe that there are conversations to be had, is, I think, something that would be in the mind of people who are getting to grips with foreign policy. And if I had to take a small bet on a couple of areas where I suspect those conversations will take place, one would be trade. Perhaps that's not surprising because I think a strong tariff regime, many people in China would argue, is meant to be a starting point, not an end point for negotiations. The other one is an issue that was big in Trump term one. Hasn't been much heard in the last couple of years, but I suspect it's going to come out again. That's North Korea. The DPRK issue, when actually Donald Trump's very unconventional diplomacy in which he went to meet Kim Jong-un triggered a whole variety of concerns in Beijing, who of course regard North Korea very much as their wayward but protected state, so to speak. And so maybe DPRK diplomacy part 2 might just be one of the things that emerges as part of what I suspect will be a very unexpected series of twists and turns when it comes to foreign policy. We actually know quite a lot about the different viewpoints that exist within China's foreign policy-making elite about a Donald Trump presidency, largely because they have the experience, as does the rest of the world, of having seen him in the White House once before, and they've drawn certain conclusions from that. It may surprise some people to know who think that perhaps China's a very monolithic place, that actually there are quite different opinions depending on which part of the establishment you come from. The question we'd really love to know, but I'm afraid I don't have the answer, and I suspect that anyone who knows the inside story ain't telling, is what Xi Jinping, the Chinese leader himself, actually thinks. Directly speaking, we really have no very good idea about that. But we do know what lots of people who work in the very, very rich range of think tanks and policy institutions in Beijing have to say. And I'd say, very broadly speaking, you might divide it into three groups, but not of equal size. I'd have said that of that grouping, maybe 20% of them were what you might call foreign policy traditionalists, the Chinese equivalent of, the people in Foggy Bottom, let's say, who like predictability. They are not fond of US administrations of any stripe, certainly not for the last 15, 20 years, Obama, Bush, whatever. But they do say, well, look, we kind of know what these people are doing, and it's best to stick with something that we know with. Then it's a group that's probably about half of the total, and that is a group that says, we don't care. Any US administration at this point is going to be in confrontation, maybe not in military terms, but certainly in terms of restricting technology, in terms of trade restrictions, all of the things that are trying to keep China down. And Harris, Biden, Trump, doesn't matter. But then there's an interesting group of people, maybe 30%, who actually do say, well, look, maybe President Trump is good for China. They would say the state of the U.S.-China relationship has been pretty bad for the last few years. You remember a couple of years ago, there was the so-called balloon incident where essentially a Chinese spy balloon, which was floating over the United States, caused much more of a diplomatic incident than I think the Chinese had expected, and certainly than usually happens with the U.S. And that's under the current outgoing administration. So there's no sense that things have been calm, although after the APEC meeting in San Francisco a year or so ago, there was a decent reset of the relationship on various areas, including military-to-military talks. But in terms of a big overall reset, that's something that I think a lot of Chinese policymakers think is just unlikely to happen with any conventional US administration. As the incoming administration says of itself, it's not business as usual. And they think, well, maybe that is an opportunity. Now, what that opportunity is won't be clear on day one, maybe not even clear in month one, because tariffs and other much more confrontational policy measures may be put into place right away. But I think the Chinese are bracing themselves for this, and they expect that it might, just might, be the opportunity for a discussion about how power in the Asia-Pacific and beyond, and in terms of the competition over technology and energy policy, how those are going to be resolved. That is one area where that small but significant group of people, maybe 30% of the total, are interested to see what a second Trump presidency might bring for China. A roll of the dice, but one that might just come up with 2 sixes or might come up with 2 ones.